Okay, tonight we're going to be starting off with ancient China, so we're going to go way back in human history, many thousand years, to get all the way back to 7,000 BC or so. Chinese history is extremely long. Chinese civilization is one of the oldest of all major human civilizations we'll talk about in this class, so it goes way far back. You can see we're going to go over a lot of time in the next hour or so. Particularly from about 2000 BCE or so, and then up to 200 BCE. So, 1800 years, give or take, that we're going to kind of stick to the highlights to get past in the next hour or so. And just like with all the other civilizations we've talked about, we're going to start off with geography. So this is a map of where modern China is today in the world. China occupies eastern part of the Asian continent, especially along the Pacific Ocean. So that's the size of modern China today. Ancient China is normally much smaller, only about the eastern half of what is modern China today. China in our time went out and conquered some northern and then western provinces, especially Tibet in the 1950s. So that's where China is on the map today. And you should know that because we just took a map quiz on it. Here's a map, more of a kind of climate and topographical map of ancient China. And ancient Chinese civilization started off, much like other civilizations we talked about so far in this class, along two major river systems. So there is a northern river system called the Yellow River, which you can barely see on this map. Maybe there's a better one I can show you up here somewhere. Oh yeah. Here's a little bit closer map of ancient China, so you can at least see the waterways a little clearer. The northern river system is called the Yellow River. That river often overfloods its banks and deposits fresh water into the soil, so the soil is fairly easy to grow. The Yellow River's problem, though, is that sometimes every few years it overruns its banks so dramatically, especially in the ancient world, that the path of the river itself changes, it alters. So it could really be destructive of any farms that are built out in that area. The northern area is much more colder climate, harsher climate than the southern river system called the Yangtze. The Yangtze is known to be much more consistent, decade after decade in its path. Doesn't overflow its banks to the point of destroying the farmland or just the territory around it. So the Yangtze is seen as much more predictable, decade after decade, century after century, and tends to create a very kind of lush, very fertile valley as it empties out of the mountains and goes toward the sea. And for some reason or other, and historians are still arguing about this today, if we go back to the climate map or the topographical map, ancient Chinese civilization actually starts off along the Yellow River, the northern river, which could, vary its path widely and destroy a lot of area around it, and had a much harsher climate. That's where the first big Chinese farms and cities start to develop, which is very mysterious to a lot of historians. So there's a lot of historians that have analyzed why that would have happened, because logically you'd think that the first farms, big farming communities would have popped up along the much more predictable, easy to farm areas in the south along the Yangtze. One big historical theory is that the Yellow River, when it overfloods its banks so dramatically, it actually deposits more fresh water into more farmland along a kind of wider territorial range than the Yangtze normally did. So that made much more land easier to farm. And then you get the old game theory, where land that's easy to farm, that grows food, more food for its community, much easier. You don't have to give all of your workers in your society over to being farmers, which means you can keep a certain percentage of the workers aside and let them go into kind of high technology development, and they can go on to make improved pottery or farming tools or weapons, and they tend to conquer their neighbors and start establishing empires, centers of wealth and power for their area. So that starts off along the Yellow River, the northern river first. And some historians still argue today over exactly why that happened. Also looking at the topographical map, you can see the two river systems, and then there's this giant kind of arid desert-like area to the north of those rivers. That area is generally called the Gobi Desert, which is one of the largest and most inhospitable deserts in the whole world. And even beyond that desert, there's a lot of kind of desert-like plains, even north of that, called the Mongolian Plains. So those are so difficult to pass, even today, but especially in the ancient world, before we have our modern technology of train travel and cars and air conditioning, especially. But in the ancient world, they're very, very difficult to move large amounts of people through those deserts. So China generally is not invaded by a massive foreign force that's big enough to conquer all of China. There's just no northern invasions that come in of that scale for many, many, many centuries. So China is kind of isolated from northern populations by that desert, and is also isolated from western areas like India or Persia further off to the west by this gigantic mountain range, the Himalayan mountains that we've already talked about before in relation to India. Those tend to isolate China from all those western territories. So ancient China is able to grow up because of its geography, in a very kind of advantageous setting where foreign powers cannot really invade for a long, long, long time, and also has these major river systems that allow its own civilization to grow and develop and blossom in virtual isolation from much of the rest of the world. So that's Chinese geography real quick. Now getting into their kind of earliest towns and cities. Like a lot of very early history of these farming communities that eventually grow into large cities and become fairly complex civilizations, a lot of their early government ideas are kind of based in myth and legend, and historians have a difficult time understanding whether or not these myths that we still learn about today, these legends that are still told, are actual reality of like historical governments that existed, or if they're just kind of legends about how the Chinese civilization got to be so much better than the rest of the world. Because some of these legends say that some mythical Chinese leaders like created the idea of family and farming and writing things down and eventually paper, which obviously isn't true because you have families and farms and all that kind of stuff in other civilizations. So a lot of these legends don't appear to be completely reliable as historical documents. One of the legends, though, talks about a mythical ruler named Yu, who is here on this slide. And his legend is that he is from a family that is not part of the royal family that is kind of running the region along the Yellow River when he's alive. He's from a kind of outsider family, a normal kind of working class type family, possibly landowner, so it may be a little bit wealthy. But the legend is that Yu comes to government attention, and the king appoints Yu to be the head of a big irrigation project to divert part of the Yellow River into a series of irrigation ditches, basically to bring more river water to more land in order to increase the amount of land that's farmable along the riverside to get more food for the civilization, for the society. And the legend says that Yu is so successful at that, his system works so well, that he's actually promoted in the government from this project to be one of the head kind of irrigation planners for all of the society, and works his way up through the administration so high that he comes into contact with the king personally, and the king comes to trust him so much over the decades that he actually appoints Yu to be the heir to the throne, which would make Yu almost into the royal family itself. So when the city king dies, Yu becomes the next king, even though he's not a biological member of that family. And the legend says that Yu goes on to create a formal dynasty of his own family, which becomes known as the Xia dynasty. And here is a map of the center of the Xia dynasty, which, according to these legends, is known as China's first major dynasty that lasts for several hundred years. So there's a kind of line of kings that are related by birth to each other, much as other dynasties we've seen in other world civilizations already. For a long time, historians thought that this was just a legend, just a myth, but now there appears to be some archaeological evidence to support the idea that there is a Xia dynasty that is rising along the Yellow River at this point, around this point in Chinese history, and that this Xia government is kind of centrally powerful in the area. So there's a lot of towns in this area. There's palaces. There's even tombs for wealthy people and for the royal family. And there's buildings that seem to have been specialized kind of weapons factories that seem to be popping up all along the Yellow River at this point. So that indicates to us that there's some amount of like centralized control. The Xia, though, are eventually overthrown by some type of military rebellion. And it's interesting because archaeologists also date the entrance of bronze weaponry into China at this point. So it's possible that some rebels, possibly big landowners who have the wealth and the means to kind of invest in new technology, build up bronze outfitted armies, and they fight against the Xia armies, and they actually win. So they overthrow the Xia government around 1750 BCE. So the Xia are out after about, what's that, 450 years or so. And that gives rise to the new government called the Shang dynasty. The Shang have a central problem, though. It appears that the many leaders of the rebellion against the Xia didn't really trust each other all that much, so they established a new royal family, the Shang family. But the other leaders don't really trust that family in particular, so there appears to have been some kind of political deal made with the Shang leadership, where the Shang allow each of the big landowners, the kind of nobles or the lords, to really keep governing their own local areas, their own lands, almost like their own little kingdoms. So the Shang dynasty is often said to be an empire in name only, where the royal family has authority and power in the central cities, but not much authority out in the localities, because that's kind of farmed out, outsourced to the lower level landowners, and they run their own territories like their own little fiefdoms, their own little kingdoms. The Shang, though, appear to be desperate for any means of trying to increase their authority, their government power, their centralized role throughout the whole so-called Shang Empire. And one way of doing that was to create a system of sacrifices, even out in the localities, that on certain kind of specified days or certain ceremonies, that the landowners and even some of the peasants had to give dedication and food or incense or something, or even clothing, to the central gods, so that the gods could continue giving favorable, good information to the Shang emperor, so they could run the government well and for the continued prosperity of everybody. This appears to have been run by the central government, the Shang family, to the point where some of the sacrifices became human sacrifices. So some of these rituals included ritualized decapitations, sometimes of thousands of people. So you get a growth in human sacrifice, and the Shang appear to try to extend that control as far as they possibly can, and that appears to have angered enough people over the centuries, and landowners and average peasants, and a lot of people watching their family members being sacrificed, that this eventually builds up an insurgency against the Shang in the 1100s that will overthrow them. But the Shang also appear to have been so desperate for any means of political control throughout their society that they enforce a very rigid social stratification system. So that means that it's basically a social class system where the royal family is up on the highest level, the Shang family itself and its highest advisors. They're in control in the big cities, and they say at least that they control the whole empire, but we know historically through the evidence that mostly these aristocrats, which is really just a big fancy intellectual term for rich people, they own their own lands, they govern their own lands pretty much independently of the centralized Shang government. So those two groups are really on the top. Depending on where you are, if you're in one of the big central kind of government cities, then the Shang government has a lot of authority there. If you're out in one of the localities, out in the countryside, it's probably the local landowner who has most of the authority and is kind of running the legal system and running the economy. Below that high level, you have a kind of secondary level of what we call artisans. These are specialized workers who work in what we call skilled trade. Like today you have like master carpenters, or people that learn a trade over many years, master table makers or cabinet makers or glass workers or something. People that go and work for an expert, usually as like a younger person, teenager or in your 20s, and you work alongside the master craftsman for several years as an apprentice, basically helping the master craftsman do their work, and you learn the skill from them over, again, several years. Then you can become a master carpenter, a master table maker, or whatever you're trying to be. But it takes so many years to learn that skill. It's a very refined position. So it's like it's an art to be able to create something like that. It's an art to be able to create a perfect level table that lasts many, many years. So historians call those kinds of workers artisans, basically specialized workers. And in the Shang dynasty, they make writing instruments. So you get the introduction, the growth of written language during the Shang dynasty. They make weapons, they make pottery, they'll eventually make silk, they'll make all the kind of specialized goods in society. So they're a favored class of people because they have that high level of kind of trade education, trade school education, basically. So they're a little bit wealthier than everybody else, but not as wealthy as the big landowners, not as influential. Below them are the average peasant farmers. This is the mass majority of society. Probably at least 90% of society are out there just in the countryside, working on the farms, working in the ground to grow the food that society depends on. So without these peasant farmers, there wouldn't be enough food for the higher classes to eat, and pretty much everybody knows it's an ongoing problem in ancient history, going up until even a couple hundred years ago when you get a big change in these social relationships. At the lowest level, you do have slavery in ancient China, and the slaves are often either debtor slaves, or they are criminals, convicted criminals, or they are prisoners of war. And they're the ones that do the hardest labor work. They build the roads, they build the dams for the river systems, the dikes that trap water and move water around. They build a lot of the big public infrastructure, government infrastructure, roads, palaces, walls to protect cities. So they are the kind of menial labor force of society. So, questions about any of that? Anything with the Xie, the Shang dynasties? Like I said before, eventually by the 1100s you get so much kind of social outrage against the Shang leadership in so many ways that you get a giant popular revolt that some large landowners join against the central administration. The legend says that basically the Shang governors have grown so corrupt over the centuries that the people on the outside landowners are just angered at their rule, and they're looking for a good chance to overthrow them. And a giant revolution hits, or the biggest revolution hits in 1122 BC that finally overthrows the Shang dynasty and builds up something new. The new dynasty will be called the Zhou dynasty, largely because the head leader of these uprisings, one of the big landowners who really invested in this and built up his own private army and brought peasants in to help overthrow the Shang in collaboration, cooperation with other big landowners, but he was the kind of leader of it. His name is King Wu, and he comes from an area called the Zhou. So he comes from just one of these countryside estates, basically. So when the Shang are overthrown, a lot of the leaders look to this guy named Wu, and they establish him as the new king, and his family becomes the next royal family. They become known as the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou leadership immediately run into a problem, and it's a very similar problem that the Shang had run into. A lot of the kind of other landowners don't really trust a centralized government too much. So you often get this problem in revolutions of different groups of people against one centralized authority. They don't trust each other with absolute power, with centralized power, and they're afraid of central government. You even get this after the American Revolution. The American Revolution ended in 1783, and you basically had a collection of 13 different states, 13 different little governments, little countries, and none of them really trusted the other. So they just wanted to run their own little country, and they were afraid of central government. Why? Because they just overthrew a king. I mean, how much more of a central government could you have? A government of theoretically one person. So just like the American revolutionaries were afraid of creating a new centralized government for any kind of United States, they just wanted 13 different governments. You have this very same problem at the start of the Zhou dynasty. The landowners don't trust each other, and they don't trust the idea of having any kind of central administration, any kind of new dynasty that would govern all of them. So the new king, Wu, makes a big decision, and it's a hugely important decision. Basically, the Zhou dynasty will theoretically run the whole place, but divides up all the land and gives it out to the former landowners that Wu felt he could trust, and makes them into official nobles. So they become like a nobility, theoretically under his control. But what might happen eventually when those nobles don't really trust whoever is on the throne anymore? They could try to overthrow him. The immediate problem in King Wu's lifetime and future generations is that the nobles not only don't just really trust him very much, but they don't trust each other, so they're always attacking each other. So you get a problem in the beginning of the Zhou dynasty that's very similar to, say, the European Middle Ages. You have all these landowners out there, and they're all attacking each other, trying to get more land and power for themselves. Not just out of greed for themselves, greed of wealth and power and influence, but fear of their neighbors. I mean, what happens if you just own a little piece of land, but your neighbor owns a whole bunch more land? You get afraid of they might attack you someday, so you might attack another neighbor to take their land, and it can become fairly chaotic unless someone can kind of institute centralized control somehow. Wu also decided to make a kind of formal law code for all the working class kind of average peasants out there. So there is an attempt to kind of standardize the rules that everyone's supposed to abide by. But Wu's problem is that he's already a middle-aged guy by the time that these wars break out against the Shang dynasty. So he doesn't live very long after the Shang are overthrown. So he actually dies just about 6 years or so after the revolution is successful and this new giant Zhou dynasty is proclaimed. So King Wu isn't around for very long, and his heir to his throne is actually a small child, only about 3 or 4 years old. So the new emperor of the Zhou dynasty is basically a toddler, and that creates a gigantic problem that we've seen happen in other ancient civilizations. Are you really going to trust a little kid to actually run the place? And most governments and people don't want to do that, because get a kid on the throne with real authority, and the decision is going to be that everyone should eat chocolate for dinner every day or something like that. Everyone gets to eat candy as much as they want. be something crazy. So no one ever really wants a little kid, even if they're just by circumstance on the throne. They don't want them actually governing the place. So you get another kind of movement to establish a regency council, which again means that the counselors who had been advising the king who had just died, who had basically been kind of running the place in his name, making the big decisions, they agree to meet as a council for the next, say, 20 years or so, continue running the government until the kid grows up. The emperor grows up and becomes an adult, and he can take over and kind of run the place himself. And the dead king's brother, known as the Duke of Zhou, is appointed to be the head of the Regency Council. So he kind of makes the big decisions almost like a king. And that could be a dangerous thing, because we've seen in other places and times, like in ancient Egypt, sometimes the leaders of the regency kind of overthrow the child, maybe and throw the kid in jail or just get rid of him somehow, and proclaim themselves to be the new emperor, and they govern as emperor, or they at least try to. So that's one of the big problems, the big threats of a regency. It's an attempt at stability, but a lot of times it's not very stable. So what does the King of Zhou do? Does anyone know or want to take a guess? Actually, no. The Duke of Zhou follows his promise, and when the child grows up, the Duke of Zhou retires and lets this now adult king actually take over the government and run the thing. So the Duke of Zhou fulfilled his promises and walked away at what he saw was the appropriate time, and most of the regency went with him. Many historians argue that the Duke of Zhou's biggest accomplishment is to proclaim what becomes known as the Mandate of Heaven. And this is basically a theory of why the Zhou government is in place to begin with. So the Duke appears to have proclaimed this idea, and we'll go through the steps of the theory to kind of flesh it out and talk about exactly what it means. The first step in the theory is that the dynastic leaders, basically the emperor, the guy on the throne, has to have permission from heaven to run China, to be in control. And that basically means heaven is like a Chinese equivalent to like the gods or God. Heaven is like a kind of personification of the kind of eternal powers governing the universe. So instead of saying the gods or God or whatever, the ruler of the universe, in this theory, is just called heaven. And the governing leaders have to have permission from heaven to stay on the throne. And the idea is that heaven gives its mandate, its permission for those certain rulers to be on the throne and govern the place, as long as they run China with justice and humanity and compassion, and they basically run the place for the benefit of all the Chinese people. They're a good government. They're not oppressive, they're not harming the people, and they're trying to figure out the best way to basically help their people. So the equation is that heaven is seen as a kind of father of China, and that the emperor is like heaven's son, who has to go back to the heavenly father every once in a while and get this permission, this mandate to continue running the place. And what happens if the governor or the emperor becomes or happens to be a cruel person that punishes the people for all kinds of small little things? Yeah, if the government stops being just and humane and compassionate towards people, then heaven can revoke the mandate and give it to someone else. Basically saying that the emperor on this throne, this royal family, is not running the place well, so heaven takes its permission from that family, takes it away, and gives it to someone else. And that kind of begs the giant question, what happens when someone else gets the mandate? Basically, they start a revolt. When someone else proclaims the mandate, they basically say that the existing government is corrupt, it's horrible, it's oppressive, and it's time for us to rise up. We have like the God's permission to rise up against the government, overthrow it, to get rid of that evil, and create a new government to help the people, to relieve the people's suffering. And there's a couple giant questions that emerge from this overall theory. I mean, number one, how do you know when heaven has revoked the mandate? I mean, do the gods send a text message to all the people in Chinese civilization letting them know, okay, it's time to rise up, and you should start on Monday? No. So how do the people know that it's time? They know it's time when it starts. When the revolution begins, that's when you know that it's time for you to rise up. And that could lead to all kinds of problems that you could have. Possibly heaven has nothing to do with the revolution. It's just some rich family who thinks they can overthrow the government, and they start a revolt, and they try to get the people on its side to join the revolution by proclaiming this mandate of heaven, by saying that the gods gave it to them suddenly. Second problem that arises is, how do you know who heaven is giving the mandate to? And it's basically whoever wins. Whoever wins the civil war. If the government's overthrown, whoever ends up on top and starts the new government, they must be the one that heaven chose to help the people, to establish a new dynasty. So many historians argue that this mandate of heaven theory is proclaimed by the Duke of Zhou, specifically as a justification for what his family had just done to the Shang. Overthrew them, established a new government, and then came up with this grand theory in order to say that this was all a good thing that we did. That it was all justified. So heaven, the gods, might not have anything to do with it. It might just be a powerful political family that wants to get to the throne. And they're capable of doing so. And suddenly they have to convince the people to accept it. And this creates what some historians have called the dynastic cycle, which basically you have good government up here at the top of the circle, kind of at the high point of all this. You have a good government that's now in place, and it promises to run the government for the benefit of all the people, and we're going to do all these great things for the people. We're going to build hospitals and roads. We're going to build more irrigation. You'll have more water. You'll maybe make some schools. I mean, who knows? Depending on which government's in power and what they want to do. But you start off with a government that is pretty good and fairly honest, not oppressive, and seen as running the place for the benefit of most of the Chinese people. And then the cycle theory says that maybe that first generation of governors and the emperor, they're real good, but after they die off, their children take over. They're a little more corrupt. Then the next generation's a little more corrupt, so things get worse and worse and worse and worse down through the decades and maybe even the centuries. And you get to this kind of low point, the bottom of the circle, where the government is really oppressive, people are starving in the streets, there's not enough water, and things are just really, really bad. And that inspires some other group to proclaim the mandate of heaven at the real low point of this, and they start a civil war to overthrow that government. And when they get to the top of government again, you go all the way back around to the top of the circle, they have to make promises to the people in order to stay in power, and they run the place well, they rebuild the schools and the roads and relieve the suffering of the people. So the thing goes full circle at the start of the new dynasty, and then over the decades or centuries, that dynasty gets corrupted and makes mistakes, and it's just a circle that goes over and over and over again. It's called the dynastic cycle. The mandate of heaven can also be very dangerous, because sometimes a dynasty is not overthrown so much because it's corrupt or oppressive, but because the people thought it was just making big mistakes. And sometimes mistakes that aren't even its fault. I mean, what happens if a giant flood hits and wipes out all the farmland, and now there's not enough food to go around and people are starving? People may interpret that as a message from heaven to rise up and overthrow the government. This is heaven telling us that the government is bad, that heaven doesn't like this government, and sent this flood as the text message to everybody. It's time for you to rise up because this government isn't good enough for you. So sometimes a bad harvest or an earthquake or a flood or one of these like giant natural catastrophes, natural disasters, can be enough to convince the people to rise up against the government. Other historians compare this mandate of heaven idea to what becomes known in European history as the social contract theory, which means that the government is built by the consent of the governed. That no government can exist or should exist without the people's accepting of it. And social contract theory says basically the people allow a government to exist, but the government has a contract with its people, and not exactly always written down, but at least a verbal kind of handshake deal that will allow you to run the government as long as you run it well and you don't get oppressive and harmful of the people, because once you do, you kind of break the deal we had, and then we'll rise up against you. We'll start a revolution. And that's exactly the theory that the American revolutionists ran with eventually. They believed that social contract theory. If you ever read something like the Declaration of Independence, the government is built by the just consent of the governed, and that the people have literally the right to revolution whenever they feel like it, whenever they feel the government has gone beyond its trust, basically broken the contract, and is not just ignoring the needs of its people, but is actually oppressing the people who speak out against it. So you'll learn more about the social contract if you take history too. Talk about it quite a lot then. But again, the mandate of heaven is often interpreted as being really the Zhou's attempt to justify the revolution that it just led against a Shang, and maybe their promise to the people to run the place well. Alright, so questions about the mandate at all? Nope. Okay. Again, the Zhou dynasty's biggest kind of problem, its biggest weakness, is that it's relying on all these kind of regional, local kind of nobles, this nobility, these big landowners out there, to follow the orders from the central Zhou king. And a lot of times they're fighting amongst each other, or they just ignore what the emperor wants. So a lot of these smaller landowners build up their own private militias to defend themselves against their neighboring landowners, and you get all kinds of infighting amongst the nobles, and it's fairly chaotic for a while. And eventually some of those nobles even try to overthrow the central king, so there's a coup attempt that even succeeds in murdering the sitting king on the throne in 771 BC, and kills a large portion of the Zhou family at that point. One of the heirs to the throne survived and actually escaped those assassination plots, and the Zhou leadership under that heir decided to move the central city, the central government, out of Hao in the west on this map and move it further east at and recentered it at Luoyang, further east along the river. The problem, though, is that there's a civil war, and this kind of reconstituted government at Luoyang eventually fights off its regional nobles and survives, but is never as strong. The Zhou dynasty is never as strong as it had been before this coup attempt. So you get a kind of divide in the history of the Zhou dynasty. From 1122 to 771 is the kind of height of the Zhou dynasty, the more prosperous, stable area, and that's when the kingdom was centered in the western city Ao, and you get this kind of split into a second half of the Zhou dynasty at Luoyang, where the government is much weakened. It survives for another 300 years or so, 350 years. But it is not as powerful even as it had been before. So it appears that the major landowners of ancient China in the Zhou dynasty in the second half of it are just waiting for another good opportunity to rebel and try to overthrow what remained of the government. Unlike Zhou politics, though, there's big economic developments during the Zhou dynasty. So the Zhou were very good at especially building transportation networks, roads, and small rivers that went beyond the two major rivers and kind of moved out into the countryside even further. So people are moving around much more during the Zhou dynasty than they had in previous dynasties, and that means people are moving. They're moving around more if you have the money to, and just like today, when people go visit another place, they spend money in that place because they need hotel, they need food to eat, they spend money on entertainment, and they spend money on just the act of going from one place to another in boats or carts, and you have to take your clothes, and you have to pay security guards to guard you on the trip. So this is a big economic boom. One of the sources of an economic boom during the Zhou dynasty. And the Zhous tried to standardize money as much as they possibly can. It's not completely successful, but one thing they do is they figure out that they're making small coins as their money. And a lot of times the different landowners have their own types of coinage in their own kingdoms, but one thing they figured out was to make their coins kind of standardize according to weight, so that if you go buy something that's really expensive, instead of just taking out your bag of coins and counting them one at a time, they figured that if you just punch a hole in each of the coins and string them together, that you could use large sums of money fairly quickly. Instead of taking the time to count out each one, you just take out your string of coins and throw them down on the table, and you can buy something much faster, which means more goods can be sold at higher prices, which means companies can sell more stuff on a daily basis, which means they're more profitable, they hire more workers, and this is economic growth. But it very much relies on a standardization of the weight of each of those coins, because it wouldn't help if you throw down your string of coins and you have to count how many coins are on the whole string. So if each coin has a similar weight to it, standardized weight, then you could just measure the entire string, and that will tell you how many coins are on that one string, and it's reliable. So this whole system relies on standardized values of the coins, standardized weight of the coins, and the measure of how many coins would be on a string. The Zhou dynasty also has conflicts with raiders from the north, from what we today call Mongolia, with the Chinese at that point called the Xiongnu. And basically those northern raiders, they're not coming in with enough of an army, enough troops to really attack and conquer and control parts of northern China, kind of like occupy the place. So they're more hit and run kind of attacks, where these Mongolian warriors would hit a village in northern China and kind of loot it, take everything of value, and then run back into the northern deserts before the Zhou armies could show up to counterattack, and trying to follow the Mongolians up into the desert is kind of a suicide mission. So a lot of the Mongol raiders would kind of hit the place, take anything of value that they could, and then run into the desert so they couldn't be hit back. They couldn't be destroyed or chased. So the Zhou will deal with that kind of conflict and will start building up kind of forts, military forts, to keep troops in along that northern area to try to ward off Mongol attacks as much as they possibly could. But another reason the Mongols are successful is they bring in iron weapons. The Mongolians were trading with even Indian and Persian traders, so they get access to iron technology, the Mongol raiders, and they make iron weapons, and that's their military advantage when they hit a Chinese village somewhere. They're attacking with better military technology and they win battles. So that's what brings iron technology into China, and obviously the landowners aren't dumb. They understand. They take prisoners and take captive weapons from the Mongolians every once in a while. So they learn what that metal is, and this is a big kind of eventually boon to Chinese civilization, because this is their introduction to iron. And China actually has more iron deposits than they do of most of the other metals that China was actually using before. So when they start using and adapting to iron technology, they start building much more powerful armies than they'd ever had before. And they even start making tools, normal kind of everyday tools out of iron, especially farming tools. So the shovels and the picks and the rakes that are being used in China are much stronger than they ever had before. They could dig deeper, and the tools lasted longer. So that means farming becomes more efficient in China. You get a bigger food supply, and they can dig their irrigation ditches further. They can build roads more reliably, and they can start building larger bridges and stronger boats. So this is the kind of introduction to a higher level of metal technology that China adapted to very quickly and created a lot of prosperity. So there's a lot of economic growth and developments during the Zhou dynasty, even though there's this kind of political decentralization under the nobles, and the nobles are kind of attacking each other chaotically. So questions about that at all? Alrighty, moving on. So the central problem of the Zhou dynasty is always this decentralization. The nobles have a lot of power, and simply moving the capital city further east did not solve that problem. It's just the same problem perpetuates itself. So by the late 400s, there's another major attempted revolution by some of the big landowning families that does finally destroy the Zhou dynasty, overthrows the last of the Zhou kings. And that leads to massive infighting amongst especially the 7 largest landowning families that you see on this map here, and some of the secondary ones, a couple of the secondary ones. But this becomes known as the era of warring states. So you see that term in the textbooks and documentaries or whatnot. Basically, it's a story of, for a long time, this is almost 200 years, none of these 7 different big landowning groups could gain the upper hand over all the rest and reconquer all of ancient China. So they fight each other kind of intermittently for a long, long time. And it's kind of like if you play a game of Risk today, that board game Risk, where you start off with like 6 or 7 different people playing the game, and the globe or the map is just divided up amongst these 6 or 7 different groups, and it takes a long time to knock each other out, basically because no one person has enough soldiers or enough territory to gain the upper hand over all the rest. So everyone is just kind of desperately fighting for just mere survival, and no one can become dominant over the rest. And what you get is basically, one or two players or three players in Risk will kind of form an alliance and say, well, we won't attack each other, and we'll kind of gang up and attack this one player and try to knock him out and take over his land and divide up amongst ourselves. But what happens when those three become powerful enough to start dividing up land? None of the three trust each other, and they start looking to knock each other out. So those three turn on each other, and they may have increased territory for themselves, but now it's a three-way civil war. And they may try to make deals with each other or something, but even if two of them can get together and form an alliance against the third, what happens when they get to the edge of like knocking that third guy out? What happens to those two? They start fighting each other to the point where they abuse each other so much that the third one can make a comeback, and it's just chaotic. And that's why Risk takes hours and hours and hours to finish. Sometimes days if you're with some extremely cutthroat kind of people. It's just none of the players can gain the upper hand over the others. And once it looks like one is starting to get so powerful, it makes all the others scared, and they form an alliance against them and smack them back down. And that can go on through all kinds of cycles, through many, many, many cycles of it. And that's exactly what's happened in China during the era of warring states. It's basically none of the landowning groups can gain enough power to knock out all of the others. They might be able to knock out a couple, but when one group gets too large and powerful, the rest form an alliance against him to drag him back down. Does that make sense? Alright, so we'll get into more of the details of this era of warring states when we talked about more China another time. One really interesting thing happens in this 200 years of this infighting, this almost constant warfare. The place gets so destabilized. Ancient China is at just constant warfare for hundreds of years, and that often kind of pushes intellectuals and people to take a step back in society and say, man, we just want stability at any cost. We just want the end to the fighting and the bloodshed. This is like the Middle Ages in Europe, when the average peasants out there, they don't have enough food to eat, and they even stop reading and writing because they're just they're just trying to survive on a daily basis. They're trying to get enough food to feed their family today and to keep the attackers out of their house, to the point where they don't have time to learn to read and write so much anymore. So it's that level of chaos. And some important theories start to get developed during this warring states era. Just trying to think of a new way of rebuilding society to end the conflict and to get people to live in peace and harmony, basically, with each other. And the first of these becomes known as Confucianism. And this comes out of the life story of a Chinese guy in one of these localities named Confusa. Basically, his story is that he's from a fairly prosperous landowning family in one of these 7 districts. So he becomes educated. He has tutors, and he learns to read and kind of thinks for himself. And while he's learning all this stuff as a student, he starts coming up with this system to fix the government instability, all the government problems. So he thinks he has these great solutions, basically around his mid-20s or so, when he kind of becomes independent. So he's kind of like a college graduate who's learned all this stuff for years and years and years, and now he's got his degree and he wants to go work for the government because he has all these ideas about how to fix government problems. So he goes to his local landowners and the big powerful people in his district, and he says, I have all these great solutions for all these epidemic problems in our society. So why don't you put me in control of the government? I'll implement the problems and everything will be great. And what do the big landowners and the powerful people Think about this. I mean, he's like 25 years old, 26 years old. Yeah, they laugh him out of the room. They say, yeah, right, kid, go away. You know, the adults will handle all this. Sure, yeah. And they basically say he's too idealistic. His head's in the clouds. He doesn't have any real world experience in governing. And so they basically laugh him out of the room. They kick him out, and he becomes so frustrated with that he never becomes a government employee. He never goes into government at all. So instead, he wants to get the people on his side. So he travels from town to town and village to village and talks to the average peasants out there in Chinese society, giving them advice about how to rebuild their society. And as he's traveling around, he gets, you know, large groups like to listen to him. He kind of makes a name for himself as a kind of traveling intellectual, almost like a traveling preacher. And he develops a kind of group of followers who follow him from town to town. So almost like kind of like Jesus and his disciples, going from place to place, saying that, you know, society is corrupt and this is how we can fix it. His basic message is that society should be based on justice and humanity and compassion, and also a social kind of class-based order, a system of superiors, and that will stabilize society. So eventually Confucius, as people tend to do, he gets old and he dies. His problem, though, is that, or historians' problem for him, is that he never wrote down any of this stuff that we've ever found. So there's no kind of official writing, and there's no claims to be in any of his official writing. The closest that we have is that apparently upon his death, his followers, his like group of disciples, collected his most important teachings and wrote those down and like put them all in one big book that's called the Analect. And that's how his message is kind of preserved and spread through Chinese society. And by the time the Europeans start to show up, you know, hundreds of years later, the Europeans basically mistranslate the guy's name. They call him Confucius, which is, you know, a ridiculous thing to do. And his name was well known. So the Europeans call it Confucianism, and that's the term that goes into a lot of kind of European or Western histories of this movement. But what did Confucius actually want? What was his teaching? It's basically it's based in three different major ideas. The first one is called Run, which translates to the idea of humanity. You realize that other people are equal to you, that everyone is human and deserves to not just be kind of respected, but should not be attacked and murdered. And people have like what we would today call like natural human rights. The second one is called Li, which translates to ritual, and it's usually interpreted as like courtesy or civility. You know, there's a big difference between me looking at someone, you know, walking down the street and saying, well, they're human, so I shouldn't murder them. They have rights. But there's a big difference between me not wanting to murder them. I could still kind of treat them like crap. So Li says that you should treat them with civility. Be good to them. Be courteous. And that would kind of rebuild respect and stability in society. But the big one is called Xiao. And this translates as filial piety, which basically means that you have social superiors in this class-based system, and you owe respect and honor to your superiors. Like the son respects and listens to the father. And the farmer, the peasant, listens to and respects the advice of the landowner. Or the judge, or, you know, whoever your kind of superior in society is. And because ancient China, like most ancient societies, is hugely sexist, you know, the sister listens to the advice from the brother if the father's not around. And if there's several brothers, it's the eldest brother usually takes over. So the younger brothers listen to the oldest brother. The wife listens to the husband. The mother to the father. And if the father's not around, even the mother listens to her son. So that's how sexist the society becomes. But Confucius thought that when you combine these three ideas, humanity, civility, and this social class-based kind of system built on kind of deference, then that would rebuild this stability for society. You wouldn't need all these wars and oppression, that people would just willingly or just kind of do this out of like second nature. There's a big problem with this theory, especially with Shao. What happens if your superior in society doesn't exactly like deserve to be listened to? What happens if your higher up is actually kind of a jerk or is a thief? And that's how they only got to that higher position, is they stole a lot of money and, you know, somehow bought the land or the office or something. So basically what happens when your superior doesn't deserve respect and deference, shouldn't be listened to. The problem is that Confucius basically is apparently silent on that. So it takes a later kind of Confucian thinkers, intellectuals, to say that any governors or any landowners who don't run their holdings or run society with humanity and courtesy, then basically they forfeit the mandate of heaven, and you can rise up against them. So just because someone is older than me doesn't mean that I should owe them allegiance or respect. I mean, I know plenty of people that are older than me that appear to not be very good people. I mean, Charles Manson is older than me, but I'm not going to follow his advice on much of anything. Right? So later Confucian intellectuals will connect that, not just a higher up status, they'll connect it with a kind of merit. And especially any government leaders that don't deserve that merit, they forfeit the mandate of heaven, and they should be overthrown. But Confucius lived during this era of warring states, and so theoretically he came up with a lot of the system in order to propose an alternative to warfare. You don't need war and oppression under this system to keep social stability. It's done by kind of the goodness of society. There's another one that opens up also during the era of warring states, or at least grows during that era. It's called Taoism. Tao basically translates to the way. And this comes out of the kind of philosophical teaching of a guy named Lao Tzu. His basic teachings again get written down in a big book that becomes known as the Tao Te Ching. And his teachings are, very similar, but much more beyond just humans, but bringing in the rest of the natural world. So the number one goal for Taoism is to live in harmony with nature as much as you possibly can. Don't destroy nature. Be respectful of animals and plants. Very difficult when you're a farmer, or living off of farming goods, because the meat we eat, and even if you're vegetarian, you're eating plants. You're contributing to the destruction of plant life. But his advice is to live in harmony with nature as much as you possibly can. He recognizes that people have to eat, so they're kind of taking advantage of nature. But his advice is, you should avoid being angry, and when you get angry, don't go and start a forest fire or something like that. Don't go and slaughter a bunch of animals or kill a bunch of people when you're mad, because that's just generally a bad thing to do. Number two, he advises to avoid or get rid of our worldly ambitions, basically our greed for wealth and power and control. So kind of similar to Buddhism in that respect. And the third one is to accept the randomness in life. The idea that you can't control others, that people and all of their experience will just kind of come into your life, and you should enjoy them and appreciate them in the moment that this is happening. And don't worry about when they leave your life, when friends move away, or family members leave or die or whatever happens, that you shouldn't stress yourself out worrying about that happening in the future. And after that happens, you shouldn't pine for them. You shouldn't kind of wish that they were still in your life. You shouldn't wish that you were living in the past. That you should, stay centered in this moment. So again, sounding much like kind of Buddhism as we know it. Does that make sense? All right. And basically the theory is that if you avoid your worldly ambitions and your greed and your desire to control life so much, then you wouldn't need all these civil wars, because these civil wars are based on greed and lust for power. So if you get rid of it, kick that out of your own kind of lifestyle, then you won't have all this infighting and bloodshed. It just won't be necessary, because that's all the pursuit of greed. So this starts to really kind of get more into, especially the United States in the, say, 1960s or so. So you get a lot of American intellectuals who claim to be Taoists. So a lot of people might run into Taoist theory by running into basically kind of like hippie Taoism, Berkeley Taoism. So they had some important sayings from the 1960s that you might have run into, and one of them is that there would be no theft if there were no property. The idea that the very fact that we have divided society in land and physical goods into private ownership, that creates theft, that creates crime, or at least the desire for crime. The theory being that the division of private property into who owns what creates greed, causes greed. That people who have a lot but want more, then they'll go out and attack and do whatever they can to get more, to satisfy their desire for more. And also that the creation of private property leaves a lot of people out in the cold. A lot of people don't have enough property or food to survive. So that creates so much poverty, that creates a need to steal in society. Just for some people to have enough food to eat or have a house over their head, they have to do horrible things. And this has been kind of played with philosophically and sometimes in the real world. There was an experiment, I think up in like Portland or Seattle, like 20 years ago, where the city bought a bunch of bikes, I think they were like red bikes or orange bikes or something, and they placed them all over the city and said, this is public property. Nobody owns these bikes. Well, I guess the city does, but the city is going to allow anyone to use them whenever they want. So if you need a bike to go to the library or bike home or go to work or whatever, if there's a bike sitting somewhere out around your house, you can, as long as no one's using it, you can pick up the bike and use it, and you get to wherever you're going and you drop the bike off, and you don't own it, and then the next person can pick it up and use it how they want. And the experiment is to see what would happen with the bikes. And they bought a certain number of them and just placed them all over the city. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of them. And what do you think happened to the bikes? Yeah, exactly. They all got stolen. So that was the kind of big social experiment. Would people still have the desire to steal bikes that they can use at any time? And what's the point in stealing it to keep it for yourself if you understand that they're just going to be virtually everywhere for free? You don't need to steal it, but they got stolen anyway. And so that led a lot of people to proclaim that this is kind of too pie in the sky type of idea. But then others argued that, well, maybe it's people who came from another town and stole the bikes to bring back to their place and sell them so they can make money. So it wasn't, they're not interested in using it so much except to profit for themselves. So that was one theory that's been tested, didn't work out too well. Another kind of big kind of hippie theories that would be that gets connected with Taoism is that there would be no crime if there was no law. And that strikes right down to the kind of heart of the question. I mean, where does crime come from? Where does law come from? What causes crime? Of course, there would be no crime if there were no law, but would those acts still be committed? I mean, people might, if you get rid of the laws against murder, that might not mean that people stop killing each other. It's just that when they kill each other, they're not breaking the law anymore because there's no law. So there is no crime technically because there's no law against it. Does that make sense? But that also questions, I mean, what causes crime? Do people go around breaking laws just because the law is there? Does a law being in place inspire people to break it just for the fun of it or the challenge of getting away with it? Does the existence of law cause crime? Or does the fact that all this murder and rape going on out there in society inspire people to pass laws to try to stop it, or stop it as much as they possibly can? So is law the result of society's actions, or are society's actions the result of the law being there in the first place? So it's like a chicken and egg kind of scenario. So questions about any of those? I mean, you've heard those before? Yeah. Alright. And Taoism also becomes kind of heavily associated with artistic movements. Especially this idea of randomness in life. Just, not trying to control things and just enjoying life in the moment. A lot of artists get really into this idea in the ancient world and today, because in case you've never known, a lot of artists, like do their creative work. They create songs or paintings or they draw or they do whatever off of a moment's inspiration. They often find it very difficult to kind of work according to a set schedule, because they don't like the idea of kind of clocking in and starting to try to create something. They'll wait for inspiration to strike them, and inspiration can be very random. Sometimes it doesn't come around for a while. So a lot of artists especially go for Taoism. The randomness of life, appreciating the beauty and simplicity of life, and kind of following your will on a moment's notice to go off and do things. All right. And with the Berkeley kind of Taoism, with all these kind of like big questions, one problem with Taoism is that it enjoys the randomness of life so much that it never really gets into, or rarely gets into, an intellectual depth to try to answer these kind of centralized big questions that are posed. So the Taoists often say, well, want to get into the details of this. It's just you should avoid greed and your desire to control things in society. But again, it could be this idea of randomness and getting rid of your greed could be inspired by all these civil wars that are going on. If you get rid of your worldly ambitions and your greed and your lust for power and control and wealth, and just try to live in harmony with things around you, then there wouldn't be any civil wars. They just wouldn't exist. All right. All right, and the next philosophy is called the Yin and Yang philosophy. This is based on these two kind of forces of the universe and the natural world, and even in humanity and plants and animals and whatnot, that are seen as not really opposed to each other, not like working against each other to hurt each other. They're not like at war against each other or anything, but they cooperate with each other. They balance each other in the natural world and in human experience, human emotion. So the yin side is associated with darkness, night, and therefore the moon, and the kind of coldness of the night, the dampness of the night, and often associated with rain, floods, rivers. And in human emotions, human experience, it's associated with the kind of emotional state of people, the passivity, accepting things. And because it's a sexist society, the emotional and passive nature of people, accepting authority over them, is often associated with femininity, female. And since women are defined as kind of not physically strong, their strength is in long-term stamina. And if you look at the yang side, which is associated with masculinity, men, physical strength, and kind of action, and taking action, control, power, instead of being passive. And also defined as a kind of logical state, trying to figure things out intellectually, instead of the more, at least they say, the more feminine state of making decisions based on emotion. And the yang side is also in the natural world associated with the kind of polar differences from the yin side. So yang is associated with light, daytime, sun, heat, dryness, summertime, desert. And the key is that the people who go with this philosophy understand, and they just look around the natural world, that you need both. You need them to balance each other. Because what happens if the yin just ruled the world and there's just darkness all the time? The sun never comes back. What would happen to the farms? Yeah, the crops would all die. And if the crops all die, then the people won't have food to eat, and all the people and the animals will die. So you need that light to come back and feed the crops again. But they can't take sunlight forever, so you need the darkness to come back and cool them off and give them a break. And you need that winter time to bring the snow and the water to the crops. So you need the kind of yearly cycle of summer to fall to winter to spring to get the flow of water, and then the heavy heat, and then the harvest in the summertime, or the wintertime, or the harvest in the summer and the fall, and then the kind of crops to die off in the wintertime so they can be regenerated in the spring. And humans can't survive by being logical or based in strength all the time. Every person has emotion, and they have that passivity within them. So it's not that you can be one or the other. You're a constant balance. And the balance can sometimes be tipped in one side, heavily toward one side or the other. You can be like 90, 95, 99% of one side for a little bit. But the key with this insignia is that even when you're mostly surrounded with the yang, you have that little bit of yin inside it. And just on the other side, up toward the top, when you're mostly going with the yin interpretation, when you're heavily skewed toward the yin side, you still have that little bit of yang inside you. Does that make sense? So they're balances, and you're never completely one or the other. And you can't be, because you wouldn't survive by being one or the other. Does that make sense? Okay. Questions about that at all? Nope. All right. Moving on, the next big theory that comes out of this era of warring states is called legalism. And this is mostly proposed by a philosopher named Sun Tzu. His basic theory is fairly simple. I mean, he's watching all these wars and all this brutality, and he says that humans are naturally greedy, violent, and pretty horrible to each other. So he basically says that a lot of humans are so greedy that they treat each other like animals. They're brutes. And they'll kill each other and steal and rape and do all kinds of horrible things in order to enhance their power. So his solution was to create a powerful government with a law code, and whoever broke the law would be heavily, heavily punished. Basically theorizing that it's just only a dictatorship, a hardcore authoritarian state, could enforce the law with such a brutality that most people will follow the law, and that will create stability. The government may be very oppressive, but at least it's stable. And he eventually wrote that you can't just oppress people and expect them to kind of follow the law. You have to give some kind of rewards to them. And later political leaders will take up this idea of legalism and actually implement it. So one well-known guy named Li Se becomes one of the leaders of the next major dynasty once it rises at the end of these civil wars, and he will help run eventually the Qin dynasty as a hardcore authoritarian state, according to this legalist theory, because that hardcore, centralized state is the only group capable of instilling enough fear in society to stop people from committing crimes. Basically, you don't go out and steal a loaf of bread because you can be executed for it. That loaf of bread, unless you're starving to death, is not worth the possibility of being caught and killed for. Does that make sense? So the only people that go out and commit crimes are people that are on the edge of desperation. So, questions about that? The big question always rises in my mind is how can you guard against the leaders of that state, that government, becoming that horrible? Will the leaders of the government become so much in love with their own power that they eventually break laws themselves in order to stay in power? In other words, are the leaders also prone to being greedy and violent and brutish? And what does that mean for society?